Hello, everybody, and welcome to Economics with the Honorable David M. Walker. I'm your host today, and we're going to be talking about a pretty interesting topic that isn't addressed very often. It's starting to be addressed more and more often. It's called student loans. And so the thing is, right now we're looking at a problem with has about $1.7 trillion and a very famous case that's coming down from the Supreme Court, Biden versus Nebraska. Which is basically a case where Biden is arguing, well, I'm just going to forgive for 500 million of student loans. So that's one of the issues that are on the table. And with that, we're going to bring in the Honorable David M. Walker, the former Comptroller General of the United States, and see what he has to say about this soon-to-be famous case, Biden versus Nebraska. Hey, David, welcome to the show. We're looking today of student loans and forgiveness. There's a case before the Supreme Court, which oral arguments were heard already, but they haven't rendered their decision whether the executive branch has the power to basically forgive 500 billion. I think it's 500 million, excuse me, or some huge number of student loans. What are your thoughts on that? Can they just wipe that debt away?
Are anywhere from 400 billion to $1 trillion is what he's proposing to do. And the simple answer is, in my view, it is blatantly unconstitutional, and the Supreme Court will strike down his proposed actions. I also believe that it's irresponsible, given our current deteriorating financial condition and fiscal outlook. And it's inequitable, since it basically provides broad-based relief to people who provided no service whatsoever to this country. It's based upon a theory that the 2003 act that was passed by the Congress that authorized the Secretary of Education to exercise some discretion, listen carefully, for active duty military in the aftermath of 9/11, the president is now trying to apply that narrowly defined context to people that are fighting to protect our way of life, who are giving service to our country, to a broad swath of people who have not provided any service to our country. Only the Congress has the power of the purse. The Congress has not expressly authorized this. It would be a terrible precedent. Believe it or not, the biggest asset on the federal government's balance sheet is student loans. And he's talking about giving away anywhere from 25% to over 50% of student loans through executive order. So if you want to give away those assets, what are you going to give away next without congressional approval? So in my view, again, unconstitutional, irresponsible, inequitable, will be struck down. And frankly, in addition, in my view, it was a pure political play for votes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We'll bring in some of our panelists. With that, we have CPA Lee Newton Rhodes, and also we have Mark Lee, who's going to join us. What are your thoughts about this? We'll start with you, Lee. Biden forgiving 500. I keep thinking 500 million. We're talking 500 billion. I mean, it's
I have a comment and some questions. One is, where does he get the authority? Where does the federal government get the authority in the loan business to begin with? That's one. Two is, I think you're being nice. I think there is maybe a nefarious purpose in throwing away these loans. We see that there's no southern border. Now there's no financial security with the country. They're just destroying the country in any way they can, anything they touch. If it was chaos, eventually they would get something right. But they're getting everything wrong. I just don't get it.
What's going on right now is an ideological battle between those Americans who believe in our founding principles that help to make us great, with the understanding that we need to always strive to form a more perfect union. We're never perfect, we never will be, but we want to continue to try to improve, versus those who want us to adopt socialist state principles. And in the first case, it's limited but effective government, individual liberty and opportunity, personal responsibility and accountability, rule of law, equal justice under the law, fiscal responsibility, intergenerational equity, and stewardship. In the second, the socialist state principles, it's grow government, increase dependency on government, take control of healthcare, take control of education, don't worry about escalating deficits and debt. And right now, over the last 2 years, the socialists have been winning. But now, with the Republicans taking control of the House, there's a check. And the biggest check is going to be what happens in the 2024 elections, most importantly with regard to the presidential race, but also with regard to control of the House and the Senate.
I'm sorry, David, do we have enough Republicans with a spine to make a difference?
Well, first, I'm an independent, okay, and I have a problem with both political parties, quite frankly.
I do also, big time.
Yeah, I think too many of them, have confused duty of loyalty to party as transcending duty of loyalty to country. And if you recall, our founders warned us against career politicians, because they would become disassociated from the general public and would do what was necessary to protect themselves in their position, rather than to do what's necessary to deal with the broader challenges of the country and the interests of the country and their stewardship obligations. So, and in that regard, quite frankly, I'm for 12-year term limits, but that's going to end up taking a constitutional amendment in order to make that happen.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, let's talk about how did we get here, David. In other words, we're looking at right now, I think about 1.7 trillion in student debt, which is not anything to sneeze about. It's a pretty big debt. But shouldn't the Republicans eat a little bit of this because they passed the Bankruptcy Abuse and Consumer Protection Act of 2005, making it illegal to discharge student debt in bankruptcy, which when I saw that, and if you look at the timeline from when that took place till today, we had an explosion of student debt because what they do is they create people that are basically indentured servants in the United States because they can never get rid of this debt. So don't we have
although in theory, Nick, if you say that you can't discharge this in bankruptcy, that should make people more prudent about whether and to what extent they would take on student debt, because it can't be discharged in bankruptcy, right? I mean, you can't get rid of it. The problem is that, like most government programs, they have a good idea, but they want to provide too much help to too many with too many subsidies, and the house of cards falls apart.
I'm sorry, Dave, where's the good idea here? Where's the good idea with the federal government giving student loans versus the states or the actual universities? There's an idea. The one who's selling the product should give the loan, like they do in the car industry.
Right.
Good point.
It used to be that the federal government would guarantee the loans, okay? But
why?
Because they're trying to increase education, in society in order to increase productivity, in order to increase opportunity. And
let the colleges do that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let me come back to the issue. So the issue is that we are where we are. The question is where do we go from here? All right. For a long time, there were people who believed that you're not going to be able to make it in society unless you go to college. Well, that's fundamentally false. There are plenty of people who have made it in our country that don't even have a college degree. In fact, some of our greatest inventors don't have college degree, and billionaires, if you will. And so we need to rethink, our entire approach to education. We need to focus more on what are the needs of the economy as a whole? What are the interests of the individuals? How can we better match that? It may or may not mean college. It may mean trade school. It may mean some other types of developmental tools, if you will. And frankly, there are other countries that do a much better job of this than we do. One example of that is Germany. But again, the U.S. tends to say, well, it's a one size fits all. You need to go to college. It doesn't make any difference what college you go to. Doesn't make any difference what your degree is. Doesn't make any difference whether you finish or not. Well, that's all bunk. I mean, that's all bunk. So the whole
David,
program's got.
I'm sorry. A lot of our economy is people working who did not go to college. Electricians, plumbers, construction workers. They're picking up the tab for this, are they not?
Well, if the president's plan was deemed to be valid, then yes, they would end up. And that's part of the inequity. It's totally inequitable. Okay, it's irresponsible because of our financial condition, and it's unconstitutional because no president should have the right to unilaterally do what Biden is proposing to do. I mean, and again, I come back to what I said before. This was a blatant play to get youth votes.
No, it's definitely a play to get the youth vote. But David, one of the questions I actually had a couple of questions as you were going is, and it actually comes to something that Nick said earlier, because I know that when I got my student loans, and I definitely had both the Pell Grant and a couple of other grants, and actually I'll even say what I did because I defaulted on them and definitely had to pay the consequences for that and everything. But I also know that when I got those loans, even though I went in under a loan-oriented program, because when I went to Marquette, I went under the EOP program, which is Educational Opportunity Program, which was geared toward minorities and those that were economically disadvantaged. So I actually fell into both of those categories, coming from the rural town of North Carolina. But to a point that Nick brings up quite often, I don't remember any, and this was back in the 80s, so I know they're probably not doing it in the 21st century when my nephews are about to go to college in another 3 or 4 years, having any education around what is entailed in getting the loan. You just fill out the paperwork, you get the loan, and you are told to pay it back. But I don't know that there was any explanation even back then as to what you were getting yourself into. And that's my problem with some of our fancy credit cards as well, because a lot of times they target the college kids for those as well, whether it's a celebrity credit card or whether it's American Express. But definitely, I'm just wondering, don't we need to have some education about what the students are getting into, in that sense of having some knowledge about it? Because that's one of the weaknesses that I feel we've been suffering from for the last 5 or 6 decades.
Well, we have two issues. One issue is you probably know that if you end up going to a college campus when the new students are coming on campus, one of the things you undoubtedly will see is one or more credit card companies trying to sell the students on credit cards. All right.
Yes.
And get them hooked on debt early. Right. There are disclosures that are given, but how many people read all of that? Okay. I mean, sign here. What's more fundamentally important, Mark, is there are two things that we ought to be teaching, and it ought to be mandatory in order to graduate from high school. Number one, civic responsibility. And number two, which you're touching on, is financial literacy. There's only 16 states out of 50, and I'm pleased to say that my state, Virginia, is one of them, that requires financial literacy before you can graduate from high school. And as a result, a lot of these kids, they don't even know how to do a budget. I mean, I go to, I'm not a Starbucks fan. I call it Charbucks, but it's amazing how many people that you end up seeing buying one of these frou-frou coffees for like $5 or something, putting it on their credit card, and probably not paying off their bill every month, and therefore accruing this interest. And who knows what the real cost is, right? It's a lot higher than $5 by the time you end up adding all the interest. So the bottom line is what we really need is mandatory financial literacy before you can graduate from high school, which will be a lot of the issues we're talking about.
Yeah,
That's going to cut into gender studies.
Yeah, well, I have no problem with that personally. I don't have any problem with that. I was shocked when they told me. I was shocked when one of the administration officials testified that men could have babies. I mean, I've never been so scared in my life.
You're scared because you might get pregnant now?
I think I'm past that, but in more ways.
You're past menopause.
I more ways than one. I think my gender won't allow me to, and I'm probably above the age that would be feasible, even if it did.
Well, like I said, part of that is one of those fields that we've said that you don't need a college degree for. And I do have some friends in that field because, there's a lot of people that are doing augmented reality and metaverses and a number of other things. And I'm sure that in those platforms, you can definitely do things that are outside of the norm of what would normally go on in society, because that's part of what is taking place in those kind of simulations and all of that. But
Well, I'll take my own family as an example, right? My son's a college graduated from Villanova, through the traditional approach, in-person training, right? He got a master's degree from the University of Phoenix, mainly online. He did have some in-person aspects of it, but mainly online.
right.
He was a captain in the Marine Corps, fought in Iraq, and now he works for Google. All right. But now we'll go to my son-in-law. My son-in-law didn't go to college. He's a master electrician. He's the top electrician for the Marine Corps Museum. He makes very good money. He's got very good retirement benefits. He's contributing to society. He's going to be fine. And so those are two examples in my own family where, I've got relatives who, one of which who did have a college degree, got an advanced degree after that, served his country, got a really good job now. The other one didn't do those things, but has got a solid job in the trades, and it's going to be just fine.
Hey, Dave, I do have a question about that, though, because I've got relatives that also served in the military. Don't have any kids of my own, but definitely have relatives that served, cousins and everything along those lines, and definitely some friends. One of the things that I know has been going on for several years is that some of those jobs that you get in the military are easily translatable to the civilian world, but not all of them are. I know that sometimes that's parts of what happens in our police forces. Just because you were an MP doesn't mean that you're going to make a good cop. And I'm just using them as an example, but I know there are other fields as well. So as a proud Navy person, which I know that you are, what are some of the ways that economically that we're dealing with that, since this is the economic show and everything? And I sometimes get frustrated when I hear folks that had a very successful career in the military, and then when they get out, they wind up being part of our homeless population because they aren't able to get the equal job or the translatable job for what they were doing in the military. So I'm just wondering what, if any, new initiatives are going on in that field.
Well, obviously some occupations and some assignments in the military have more transferable skills to the private sector than others do. Those that are fortunate enough to either be an NCO, a non-commissioned officer, or an officer, you don't get better leadership training anywhere than in the military. It is by far the best leadership training, if you will.
Is that still true today?
Yeah,
I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no, that's right. It's still true today. I mean, Jack Welch, most of you probably know who Jack Welch was, who was the chairman and CEO of GE. His number one source of new management talent for General Electric was captains from the Marine Corps. All right, and so it's good, but you have other issues going on, Mark. I mean, you have the issue of PTSD. There are a lot of vets, especially with regard to, the wars in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, although, by the way, they weren't declared wars. That's another problem. We get into too many of these conflicts that we don't declare a war, so we don't know when it's over, and we stay there way too long. But we have a lot of vets that suffer from PTSD, and they are the ones that disproportionately are in the homeless population. They are the ones that disproportionately, perform suicides. And one of the tragic things that we've got going on right now is take New York City is paying hundreds of dollars a day to house and feed illegal people when we've got all these homeless vets. Something's wrong with that.
Definitely agree with you. There's something wrong with that for sure. And I actually see them right here. Actually, ironically, I think I was coming back on the bus last week, and right across the street from one of our major hospitals, actually Duke Hospital, and right in front of the VA was literally a person that could have been a veteran or just a person in general that was sitting there in the bus stop as one of the homeless folks. And I've also seen tent cities as well, even here in the small city of Durham. So yeah, that is something that is of concern to me as well. I've definitely brought it up on some of the other.
I don't want to go off on a tangent too much. I agree with what you're saying, Dave, but one can make the argument, I don't, at least they're on United States soil. With the money we're sending over to Ukraine with an open check, we're paying for health and welfare and pension costs of people there. I don't get it. Nothing to do with the war costs, even if for those who support the war.
All right. Well, first, let's talk a little bit about Ukraine. because you can only talk so long about student loans, right? But look, I think there are a lot of lessons with regard to Ukraine. Number one, Ukraine is a sovereign nation. Number two, Ukraine is not part of NATO. Number three, Ukraine is not part of the European Union. Number four, what Russia did in invading a sovereign nation was blatantly illegal and inappropriate. And the biggest concern that I have about Ukraine is that we are once again disproportionately bearing much more of the burden than we should. We have contributed both military assistance as well as economic assistance, but in total, we've contributed about 3 times as much as all other European nations combined. And some of the larger European nations have not come nearly as close to doing what they should be doing. For example, Germany, France, Italy being examples, if you will. And so I'm for supporting the Ukrainians, but I'm for taking a fundamentally different approach. And that is, we're not writing any blank checks. We will match the funding that's provided by European and other countries. But that totally changes the incentives to where Zelensky has got to start putting more pressure on European and other countries in order to get them to do more, and we'll be there to match them. And we can debate whether or not it ought to be 1 for 1 or whether or not it ought to be, something less than 1 for 1, since we're already way ahead of them. But we've got to change the incentives and the accountability mechanisms. And by the way, the same thing has to happen with regard to supporting the basic NATO budget. You still got a number of countries that are not carrying their weight, and they're disproportionately relying upon the United States. When we were 50% of global GDP after World War II, that's one thing. But now we're 22%, and we've got serious problems of our own that we need to start coming to grips with.
Hey, David, along those same lines, and I probably could get myself in trouble, and if Saj was here, he would really have it fit with what I'm getting ready to ask and everything. But would we have the same kind of reaction if it wasn't on European soil? I know for a fact that Eritrea and Ethiopia have been at each other's throats for decades, because Dad taught in Eritrea. That's why I know that and everything, because they had an exchange program between UNC and one of the Eritrean schools. Nigeria just had an election. It was a turbulent election, and there is no guarantee that they might not break out into war either within their country or within some of their neighbors. I hope that isn't the case, but I also know that was a turbulent election. So, and I'm just using Africa as an example. I could also go to Asia as well. So would it be the same reaction if things happened on those other continents that we are seeing in the reaction from the world in Ukraine?
Well, I think it's facts and circumstances. Okay. In the case of Ukraine, you're dealing with a European country that is very important, at least as it relates to agriculture. They also are important with regard to certain minerals. And they're of importance not just to Europe, they're of importance to Africa, they're of importance to the Middle East. I mean, they're the number one grain provider to Africa and the Middle East, okay, as an example. Secondly, in the case of Ukraine, you've got a democratic country and an autocratic country. In addition, in the case of Ukraine, you've got a country who is got expansionist ambitions, if you will, that may go beyond Ukraine. Although I think, given how poorly they perform in Ukraine, I think you can forget about that. But I think it's also important to understand what is the larger significance of the conflict. Okay. It's tragic what's going on with regard to Eritrea and Ethiopia, but difficult to say, but true is it doesn't have a major economic or security impact on the rest of the world.
No, I hear you what you're saying there, but that's why I brought up Nigeria, because Nigeria and Uganda actually are also some of the larger people in the lithium. And I know I know Ukraine also has a lot of lithium, but those
Yeah.
countries have a lot to do with our cell phones, our computers, and a number of other things, which is the other reason that I use Nigeria as an example, both because of the recent election, but also because I know that it is more economically in our interest to keep that area stabilized.
Mark, I'm not familiar that much with what's going on with the countries you mentioned. Is there a genocide going on over there?
There have been a couple of genocides in a couple of the African countries, but I mean, Eritrea and Ethiopia, they broke off from each other and they've been fighting at each other. It's been like one of those, if some people might say it would be what would happen if there was a true Palestine and a still Israel as it is and everything is to, if I was to give a hypothetical as to what could possibly happen. But
Well,
definitely they've been
and next door you had Sudan break up, right? I mean, they were
Right.
fighting between
Right.
Sudan. And
Right.
here's an interesting fact. Okay, Nigeria is supposed to be the third most populous country in the world by 2050.
Right,
Who would
exactly.
pass the United States? Now, the other thing, Mark, that you mentioned, which is important, is critical materials. Okay, China supplies a lot of our critical materials. All right, both for prescription drugs as well as for technology.
Who's the Einstein who allowed that?
Well, here's the difference. Okay, China has a strategic plan, and they're executing on it. We don't. We have no plan. And as
Oh, we
a
do have a
result,
plan.
what's that?
Our plan is
Show me.
not to have one
Well,
on purpose. These are not.
yeah, I will say that I think one of the reasons that we don't have a plan is we don't have an autocratic system. Okay, but secondly, because people don't want to be held accountable. They don't want to be held accountable for results.
Hey, Dan and Nick, I don't know if you guys
100%.
heard about this, but I've heard this mentioned, and it's actually been mentioned. Theoretically, Marcus Garvey, who was all about it and everything, but apparently it's actually being put out there again, and it's been put out there a couple of times. But do you think that there will ever be a chance that certain countries, whether it's Europe, because I know that there is the European Union, but there's also talk even in Africa of creating what would be called the United States of Africa. So that would mean like all those African countries unifying and being under one sort of rule, kind of like what's supposed to be happening in Europe at some point or another. But do you think that we will ever see that on either of those continents and everything where it is actually done? Because I've heard that happening and being mentioned in some social media rooms that I have been in, and there's been some interest in that notion, but I don't know that it's economically sound or even economically possible when a lot of those places, and we can even go down to Latin America, aren't exactly monolithic and don't always have the same types of government. I'm actually surprised that the European model has worked as well as it has, but I was just wondering, do you think that this is something that the U.S. from an economic standpoint needs to be concerned about if those countries, whether it's in Africa, whether it's in Latin America, or whether it's supposedly been what's happening in Europe, are actually successful and we have these United States of multiple countries, kind of like NATO, but it's the entire continent?
Nick, I think that's to you.
I mean, possibly at some point in time, but I'm not giving up on the student loans because I do have some ideas. Because one thing we have to do is go back to the old law, allowing them to discharge student loans in bankruptcy. This way, the loan would be treated as a real loan. And most people know they're not going to lend an 18-year-old, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars to go to school when the lender knows that they could discharge the loan in bankruptcy. So they're going to want
The way it is now, is there any credit check on these students? Or are they just automatically given them?
You just sign. It's like you sign the forms and here comes the money. I mean, it's what they call easy money. It's too easy money. And I used to teach kids when they were in high school. I had a couple of them that were student chess players, and they eventually went to college. And I said, well, what college are you going to? Now, they started off going to the state colleges that had reasonable tuition. But along came the sirens of the big private universities. Carnegie Mellon was one of them. The other one was a university called, I think it was Reed College or something like that, with huge tuition. And guess what these two kids did? they fell into the private university trap. They went and they took the student loans, both of them. It's like you bit the apple. They took the student loans, and I know their families. They couldn't afford to do this. They literally lived in an upstairs garage. But gosh, he had to go to Carnegie Mellon. You know what he did? He came out with $40,000 in student loans and no degree.
But my question is, how?
You know what? If they had the ability to charge it in bankruptcy, these lenders would not prey on these students when they're in their early teens, and they prey on these kids. And there is no financial education. There is no, hey, we're going to sit and work this out and figure out where to go. Now, in our situation,
Nick, you're forgetting one big thing.
Yeah.
The federal government's now making the loans.
Yeah, well, and they shouldn't be in the business. That's not a business they should be.
I agree with you, but the federal government doesn't make prudent decisions with regard to risk and return.
No, they definitely don't. They definitely don't do that. But Nick and Dave, the question I've got is,
this business.
hold on a second. The question I've got is, and I don't know the answer.
It's bad for the country.
No, I got that part, Nick, but I don't know the answer to what I'm here to bring up.
No, Nick, not all the way around. There are people making buttloads of money off of this, bushels and whatever. The universities, professors, they're able them to raise tuitions.
I sat on the other side of it for 12 years. I've been lead faculty for Northeastern University's graduate tax program. Okay, to go to Northeastern, you're talking $50,000 to $60,000. Okay, to get a graduate degree in tax. If you're paying for it, that's a lot of money to get a graduate degree in tax, Lee. Private schools, I mean, I've been up and down that road, but there's alternates out. And I'll tell you one of them, because this is where my wife was smart enough to say, hey, let's move to Georgia. We were living in Florida. Why? Well, Georgia has the Hope Scholarship. If you have a B average, you get your tuition paid for to universities like University of Georgia Tech. So my son went to Georgia Tech and paid no tuition for 4 years and got a degree at Georgia Tech. Then he went on to Duke, full scholarship, did really well at GREs, and came out with zero student debt. What's wrong with looking for the alternatives where you do not have to incur?
No, but this is
because they don't have to.
But the question at hand, and I'm going to reach out to David. But David, in this case, the Supreme Court argument, what I think they're saying is that many of the justices are saying that this is a congressional decision, and that this amount of money couldn't be just saying a president giving an executive order saying forgive all of this debt relief, right? I mean,
correct.
Do you think that's fair that we should just say that it's no different than congressional appropriations or in anything that is an act of Congress, and that you can't just do an executive order and say, do this? Right?
Under the Constitution, the Congress has the power of the purse. And this, in effect, is spending $400 billion to $1 trillion through an executive order, which is unconstitutional, irresponsible, and inequitable. And that's a terrible precedent. Okay. By the way, let me come back to something for a second. Arguably, the solution here is the government gets out of the loan business. Okay. The government might provide certain grants to selected parties. The government might end up, guaranteeing certain loans for critical occupations or whatever else. Okay, but the vast majority of them it wouldn't, and the government might end up providing some relief, student loan relief of the private sector loans if they provide certain public service, whether it be in the military or otherwise. And then I would also agree with you, Nick, that allow them to be discharged in bankruptcy, because if the private sector is the one who's got to make the loan, they're going to consider the risk. The government's not going to consider the risk. You got it right. The government says, fill this paperwork out, sign here. All right. And who's going to end up paying the tab for all the defaults? I mean, just because you can't discharge it in bankruptcy doesn't mean you're going to get paid.
Yeah. Yeah. And then they're all making major financial decisions. I mean, these people aren't legally allowed to drink. I mean, maybe they'll do financial decisions better if they drink, but and they're given no financial education or counseling. Now, if they file bankruptcy, they go through a credit counseling. Really? Okay, but prior to signing that loan, There's no credit counseling, and you got to lay some of the blame on our education system. No financial courses, totally. And the professors, I mean, I can't even tell you how much I get paid going to teaching at a private university. It's great. But let me tell you something, somebody on their side's paying for that. And it's not great for them because there's a wall between me as a professor at Northeastern and how the students actually got there. I have no clue, Dave, if they are huge in debt, they have somebody else paying for their education. I have no clue because they keep this wall between the professors and the economics of the person who's showing up to your class. You have no clue. So, and what they do is they
That's
pay.
if they show up.
Oh, pardon?
And that's if they show up. I had the privilege of teaching at the Naval Academy. They don't have a student loan debt problem, and they are required to show up.
Oh, right. Well, the thing is, all I look at teaching at private universities, that if you're paying that type of tuition and you don't show up, you're really stupid because you're paying a lot of money for that education, and you better show up. That's just a good thing to do. But what happens is that a lot of the students are duped because the high schools, they give them no financial education whatsoever. They don't explain how huge amount of debt, that it's not dischargeable in bankruptcy, that before you sign this, you really got to go through some serious counseling or go to another alternative like community colleges, which are less expensive, state universities. And then I got this whole list of really good universities. They're basically free, so you don't have to go into student debt. And so the thing is, somewhere along the line, we need to change this situation because it's getting bigger. 1.7 trillion? Are you kidding?
But why are these universities charging so much? I mean, I think it's really
because they can.
Yeah.
I mean, the bottom line. I mean, recently I'm going to do this in my monologue on World Edition. But I went to an event last week with Wake Tech, and it's an amazing community college system, and they had really amazing stories of their analogy was running a race and how certain people in the race of education, they just don't have the finances. And so they go into community colleges, and these kids are getting, or even people that are in the middle of a career.
Yes,
they're graduating and getting $150,000 jobs and getting into engineering and stuff, but they're not having to pay these exorbitant fees. So what value is, if I was to send my son to Emory right now and he's waiting for college, I'd have to pay $115,000 a year.
Yeah, get the checkbook out for
Emory. What value is that? I mean, I have the money to do it, but I mean, I'll be working until I'm 81. But
that doesn't mean it's a smart thing to do. Just because you can doesn't mean you should.
But where's the value? Why am I paying that kind of money? Why am I paying $150,000 or $200,000? I mean, the state universities, we're getting a steal of a deal of Carolina for our daughter.
That's true.
She's in state.
UNC,
right?
NC State.
Or NC State. Or David, you're in Virginia, I think, right? So the Virginia schools, University of Virginia. Probably very competitive to get in there from Virginia. University of Virginia is a top school. You got Virginia Tech engineering. Randy Woodson, our chancellor, says if you don't get into state or Georgia Tech, you go to Virginia Tech. But the bottom line is that I just really wonder whether people need to start looking and saying, wait a minute, why is the tuition going this high? I mean,
one of the reasons it's going that high is because of the infrastructure cost. Okay, another reason that it's going that high is because of the disconnection between the people who are paying and the people, and the people who are benefiting. I mean, the government is providing all these loans, and as a result, people aren't having to come out of pocket right away in order to be able to pay it, so they don't take it as seriously as they should.
Right.
Dave, what do you mean infrastructure? The infrastructure costs. These colleges, a lot of them have very, very large endowments that are just sitting there. So what do you mean infrastructure?
University got those.
What I mean is their buildings and everything associated with physical plant.
No, I get that. My point is they have the money. They're just not using it.
That's a whole different issue, but I hear what you're saying.
That's a whole different issue.
But you have to pay these professors for tenure. You have to pay them for all kinds of things. And then in University of North Carolina or Duke or any university, a lot of research. So one of the advantages I see for the larger universities is You got to keep the professors. You got to pay them. You got to tenure them. Money coming in for research and the sciences and engineering at NC State, and maybe, David, the answer is commercializing those technologies that they're building in the universities and then getting revenue from that. Because there's some venture capitalists will go in, like at Stanford, and they'll identify a cutting edge technology, but that's not really happening in North Carolina. We've had a very few amount of companies that have been able to spin out of the university. I think the most recent one was Liquidia, and then before that, Cree, which was founded by NC State graduate Neil Hunter, and now it's Wolfspeed, which is a multi-billion-dollar company, right? But those are some things to consider.
And it's not just the universities. Look at DARPA at the Defense Department. Who created the concept behind the internet? DARPA did. Okay, and so there clearly needs to be more done to be able to make sure that the taxpayers benefit from the innovation that occurs in government to a much greater extent than has been the case in the past.
Yeah. But other than votes, what was the interest of Joe Biden just to do a blanket forgiveness of $500 billion? In other words, just write down the asset base. And doesn't that show that this gentleman is fiscally irresponsible to most of the American citizens? Okay. I mean, I just don't see this guy being lucid.
Well, unfortunately, he is the last fiscally responsible president that we had was Bill Clinton. Nobody since Bill Clinton has been fiscally responsible.
But it was a different type. But it was a different world, though. I mean, look, and I know he was your boss for a few years, right? But there were
actually,
no wars.
Actually, it was never.
Oh, no, you weren't in the Clinton administration.
He nominated me to be Comptroller General of the United States, but Comptroller General is head of the Government Accountability Office, which is in the legislative branch. So I work for the Congress of the American people. I had to be independent from the president. I had to be independent.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry, but
no, that's all right. It's an understandable. It's an understandable.
But the point is, during that time, it was a different time, and that you didn't have a lot of wars. I mean, there was a relatively peaceful time, right? But he did focus on the economy.
That's a whole different story. We never should have gone into Iraq to begin with. It was done based upon false pretenses. It cost trillions of dollars, thousands of lives, created a vacuum in the Middle East, eliminated a check and balance against Iran. And even my son, who fought in Iraq as a Marine Corps officer, agrees with that statement. I mean, and so, we stayed in Afghanistan way too long. We should have gotten out as soon as we neutralized Al-Qaeda. We stayed in there for 20 years, and we exited in one of the most embarrassing ways in the history of mankind. So, I mean, but people made those decisions, but they're not adequately being held accountable for those decisions. And that's part of the problem with our system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And don't we have the Government Accountability Office, which says we have a lot of government, but no accountability? That's what's going on in the GAO, because the way I see media, which is supposed to be the fourth estate, they're supposed to bring up these issues, David. And other than seeing you on 60 Minutes years ago, they're out to lunch on these issues. It's almost like the government's broke, but we're going to ignore it. Social Security's broke, we're going to ignore it. Medicare's broke, we're going to ignore it. Student debt's 1.7 trillion, but who cares? It's like our total fiscal responsibility seems to be totally irresponsible. And the candidates and the media just don't seem to address these issues. And Washington, D.C., I don't think they're helping out any.
Stay tuned. I'm going to be testifying before the House Budget Committee. Originally, it was going to take place this Wednesday, but it's been postponed. We don't have a date yet because the president is going to submit his budget to the Congress on Thursday, only a little over 5 weeks late. Let's see what he proposes. But preliminarily, what I hear he's going to propose is additional spending, more mandates, significant increases in taxes, and no basic plan to be able to address the disease, which is out of control spending, in particular mandatory spending.
Dave, I have a question for you. Is there any reason why zero-based budgeting is not more common in government?
Yeah, because government doesn't want to do zero-based budgeting. I mean, I can tell you that when I was head of the Government Accountability Office, one of the things that I demanded in addition to having a plan and to focus on outcomes, was that when we prepared our budget every year, that we did not start with the base. In other words, we didn't say, all right, how much money we get last year? What's inflation been? What else do we want to do? And just add on to it, assuming the base was okay. That I said that anything, for example, that was a one-time investment, whether it be technology or whatever it might be, we take that out of the budget. And that we started adopting a zero-based concept, all right? But part of that was because of the leadership from the top, and part of that because we're supposed to be in the performance and accountability business, and I'm a big believer in leading by example and practicing what you preach. A vast majority in government aren't that way. A vast majority of people in government that are part of the bureaucracy, want to assume the base is okay and just build on it. A vast majority of the political appointees that are in government are only there for 2 or 3 years. They're not focused on economy, efficiency, and effectiveness at all. They're focused on, PR and sexy policy issues and things that they can start and complete, within their tenure, so they can say that they accomplished something. So, the whole system has got to be re-engineered.
Mhm. Yeah.
Thank you.
The only question is, when is this going to happen? Because one of the problems that I've seen, David, is that there's a country called Venezuela, which is just south of us. It has the largest oil and gas reserves in the world, larger than Saudi Arabia. Can you imagine? And what's happened to Venezuela? Well, they decided to embark on this socialistic agenda that made everybody happy. And today they're completely broke.
Nobody's happy.
And nobody's happy. Right.
The elites.
Right.
I've been to Venezuela before too. It's just so sad what's going on in that country. A democracy that's just been completely destroyed.
They destroyed themselves, Steve. See, here's the poster child of what was a very wealthy country. The road to hell being paved with good intentions. Let's forgive student loans. Let's spend more money on worthless projects. And let's make everybody a socialist. Let's do reparations. Let's do all this stuff. Okay, and they did it. And today they're all broke.
Yeah, I wrote a paper on that, Emory. They also used import substitution. They try to produce their own domestic industries with state-owned industries, which typically doesn't work very well.
The
India
richest
used to do that as well.
country in South America. Now, let's go look at the United States. They're heading to this road of perdition. There's absolutely no question. If you looked at the economics of what they're doing and their projections, we are heading to the route of Venezuela, where we're going to be broke. And the thing, we're broke already, but we're going to be Venezuelan broke, which is big time broke. So we'll be the richest country in the world, just like Venezuela is the richest country in Latin America. But our leaders in Washington don't even see it. Yet it's written everywhere. Everywhere you go, everything that you see, all the demographics that you're seeing with Social Security going broke, Medicare going broke, the country's broke. The debt level exceeds more than 100% of GDP. That's Spain.
Stay tuned for the testimony later this month.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't want to paint such a negative picture, but any person who is wealthy in the United States will be looking for their exit visa to Canada or to some country, which almost any country would do today, that's better off financially than the United States, because we're in a heap of trouble, and nobody in Washington wants to acknowledge it. Instead, let's give away another $500 billion. We don't have the $500 billion to give away.
But typically the United States, I don't know why we continue to be able to do it, because we can print more money. I mean, sooner or later.
Well, you saw what happened when they did that. It was called inflation. Okay. And that's what happened in Venezuela. That was one of their solutions. They printed more money. Now you take a wheelbarrow of Venezuelan money to the grocery store, then you go to the grocery store, all the shelves are empty. So you know what they're doing? They're leaving the country to come to the United States. By the way, big mistake. They need to go up to Canada. They're more fiscally sound than we are here. But they're leaving the country of Venezuela, the richest country in Latin America. So because you have this book, America in 2040, right? Still a superpower. America in 2040 may be broke. It may be Venezuela in 2040.
Don't forget the question mark.
Yeah, yes, it does say.
By the way, there's a good
question mark.
Maybe next week when we have David Walker on, Fareed Zakaria brought up some good points about China and it's changing in the world. It's changed on the nuclear strategy, the economy. And, you look at the U.S. now, in the old days, we had the former Soviet Union, but of course, you're going to have a much weaker Russia, but you have Russia, China, and North Korea. The fact of the matter is we have more nuclear warheads pointing towards our country now from all of these countries eventually. Plus, let's not forget Iran, who's now sitting on a nuclear weapon. I mean, this is ridiculous. And we, any president of the United States, we're saying, well, let's go talk to Saudi Arabia. Let's go talk to Iran. I'm going on a limb and saying, look, I don't think we need to have a foreign policy that's working with any of these countries. But,
well, in reality, what should happen is that we should eliminate a vast majority of the nuclear weapons and just have enough to deter nuclear war. Okay. I mean, we spend a huge amount of money. We've got enough nuclear weapons, to be able to destroy adversaries multiple times over, which makes no sense for us or for them. The other thing you got to keep in mind is that, the Soviet Union was never a true superpower because it was never an economic power. Yes, it was a military power. Yes, it was a diplomatic power, but it was an economic power. And I'll give you one quick story where we talked about, equality. I mean, I went to Russia the first time in 1979. That was the heart of the Cold War when Jimmy Carter was president. And we're all thinking of him now. And I think he's probably the best ex-president we've ever had. But
no news. We haven't heard anything. So he's still
I know, but he's on hospice, so it's only a matter of time. But my point is, when I was in the Soviet Union in Moscow, we went around, had an in-tourist guide who was communist trained, who said, here on the right is Moscow University, one of 4 universities in the Soviet Union. Here in the Soviet Union, everybody has equal opportunity to go to university. So, me, the shy guy in the back of the bus, I raised my hand up. I said, ma'am, could you help me? I said, you said you had 4 universities in the Soviet Union and everybody has an equal opportunity. I said, we've got more than 4 in Boston. How can you have equal opportunity for everybody to go to college? And she went off script a little bit and said, well, here in the Soviet Union, everybody's equal, some a little bit more equal than others.
There you go. Remember when Rocky fought Drago?
Oh yeah.
Well, I was hoping I'm watching the Creed movies at night. I'm going to try to go with Creed to see Creed 3 this weekend with my son, but it would have been funny if I heard Rocky's not in this movie, but wouldn't that be funny if Rocky was running for governor of Pennsylvania or the U.S. Senate or the White House? I mean, why not? Rocky Balboa for president. Hell, I mean, he fought the Soviet Union in Rocky IV.
Well, right? Pennsylvania's going to need a new senator before long.
Well, there you go. Rocky Balboa for the U.S. Senate. I just made that up. I think it's great. Yeah. He's got a lot of philosophical quotes.
Steve, maybe that's what we need then. Just a regular patriot American from the outside the establishment who's not there in Washington to make friends and worrying about, getting reelected.
But that's the opportunity Donald Trump had, and he really blew it. I mean, when you think about it, Trump,
did he? Did he blow it, or was it the establishment so well embedded that it's virtually impossible to push back?
I know we're getting off topic here, but I really believe that when Trump did win, I thought that he had a good opportunity, having not come through the political ranks, that the one thing the U.S. would need is a businessman who could come in and had nothing to lose in terms of working to get things done, but he never got out of the campaign mode. And I think it was just,
in fairness to Trump, up until COVID, a lot of people thought policy-wise, taking away the character, he was doing a really good job.
Well,
strictly in policy.
Let me jump in here. First, I think with Trump, you have to separate policy from personality.
100%.
In my personal opinion, most of his policies were very good. All right. But he has a polarizing personality. Personally, I do not want Trump to be the Republican nominee because I think he's too divisive and he's too polarizing. On the other hand, let's look at Joe Biden. Joe Biden's policies, in my opinion, are terrible, most of them. All right. And what's going to end up happening is if the American people are provided the option of Trump versus Biden again, then I think you're going to see a viable third option. And I would be for a viable third option. And in fact, I'm actually working on an effort that would generate a viable third option if that's the choice the American people are given.
Yeah, because you're
Steve, can a third option outside one of the two parties have a viable chance? Ross Perot tried but failed, or Ralph Nader, but these two parties, don't they monopolize who's going to be elected?
The key is ballot access.
100%. Okay.
The effort that I'm referring to will gain ballot access. It's already gotten ballot access in a number of states. It's got a plan that it's executing on to get it in all 50 states. Keep in mind that president is decided by the Electoral College. Keep in mind that in all but 2 states, the electoral votes are awarded by who wins a plurality of the state votes. Keep in mind that over 70% of Americans believe that we're headed in the wrong direction. Keep in mind that for the first time in the history of the United States, over 50% of Americans believe that our best years are behind us. Keep in mind that a significant majority of Republicans don't want Trump to be the nominee, but he's got that 30% base, 30 to 35% base is going to stick with him. Keep in mind that a majority of the Democrats don't want Biden to be their nominee.
But we also have to keep in mind, in order to get elected with an electoral college, you need a certain number of votes. And split 3 ways, it's going to make it much harder.
You need a plurality of votes in enough states to get 270, and that's part.
Some states will be Democratic regardless, and some Republican regardless.
And that's already been considered. Look, I mean,
Okay.
The United States may not have a plan. We got a plan.
Yeah.
And we're
Sign me up.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting.
NoLabels.org. NoLabels.org.
NoLabels.org. Thank you.
It's interesting to say about Trump and his policies. I think when we first got started, his policies were pretty good. But here's a problem. One problem I have, which I had to fact check because Biden briefly mentioned it in his State of the Union address. He goes, 25% of the national debt was accumulated during the Trump administration. I was going, 25%? That's a lot. That can't be true. So I went and fact checked it. It is true. 25% of the national debt was accumulated under the Trump administration. I just don't see him as a viable option. On the other hand, you have Biden. Biden graduated like in the bottom of his class or in the bottom quartile of the law school. And the guy is just not that bright. And
Nick,
some of it's showing through with what he's doing with the national. We're hugely in debt. And he goes, well, let's just forgive $500 billion. So I'm going like, okay, so I can't.
Here's what's going on. I know we got to go. Here's what's going on.
What?
The Democrats cut a deal to make Biden president if he adopted the socialist agenda of Sanders and OAC. That's what happened.
You mean Venezuela? The social agenda.
That's what's being executed on. That cannot be allowed to continue.
Yeah, we end up like Venezuela. I mean, that's
There we go.
very
That's
sad.
it.
Very true.
Right.
You know,
That's the bottom line.
Venezuela.
Thank
Anyway,
you all so much. See you next week. Always
Yeah,
great
Take
to
care,
hear
Steve.
more.
comments, and yeah, we'll see you all next week.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.